Hey everyone, it's DrRic. Today's tutorial is on hypoglycemia. Hypoglycemia, I'll hear about it. I'm pretty sure that a lot of lay people understand what that means. Usually it translates to low glucose. I don't like when people say low sugar. Sugar is a man-made product. We don't really have it in our bloodstream. In fact, when you eat sugar, that's the crystalline white stuff, or you see sugar on the label that your nutrition bar has a little sugar in it. Usually sugar, once it gets into the stomach, it gets broken down by enzymes in the stomach to glucose and fructose. And that's what we have to deal with as far as low glucose. So let's try to get rid of that nomenclature sugar. So when you have, it'll make it a lot easier when I describe what happens. So hypoglycemia, low glucose. If this is the first time you're finding me, don't forget to hit the subscribe button and the alert button down below to find out when I do new videos. So why am I talking about this? Because with all this great information that's coming out, whether it's anecdotal or proven from before, it's great to utilize knowledge and data to fix the problems that we see in the clinic. And what's the biggest problem we see in the clinic? Truthfully, there are diseases, and there's several levels of diseases, but the biggest, most abundant problem is weight, obesity. And obesity carries with it, you can have obesity, you can have overweight, you can have just a BMI greater than 25. But either way, having problems with excessive weight usually carries with it diabetes, or pre-diabetes, whatever you want to call it. I think really just pre-diabetes is a nice way to say you're going to be a diabetic sooner or later. High cholesterol, high blood pressure, and arthritis and other things. So I think if you get to the root cause of what's going on with the eating, you'll take care of the three big killers in the United States. That would be heart disease and stroke, cancer, and I do believe cancer is related to inflammatory conditions that stem from excessive amounts of glucose, and then neurodegenerative disorders. In fact, Alzheimer's is considered diabetes type 3. So while we're talking about it, might as well go straight into diabetes. I think nowadays, actually in the last 15 years, because the recommendations for diabetes and diabesity and treatment didn't really do anything. The general population, if you look on I'll try to put a link down below. I did a lecture where I looked at the size of the average population in each state, and it's pretty cool. The CDC has this progressive window change and color change. So the fatter the state, or the fatter the constituents, the people of the state, the different the colors would change. It would go from white to light blue to dark blue to red. Now I think we even have black. So you can see it progress over the decades, and it's just profuse as far as how many people in the United States are getting to the point of obesity. It's going to be 1 in 2 people, including kids. So it's really a health crisis, because everybody that's taking insurance, whether it's from the state or Medicare or your own private insurance, you got to pay for those medicines. And if you have just overweight issue, usually the overweight issue will be a prediabetes state where you need metformin, a cholesterol state where you need a statin, usually you're going to be on Lipitor, and a high blood pressure problem where you're going to be on a high blood pressure pill, 1 or 2, until you can lose the weight. But most of my colleagues don't emphasize trying to lose weight. Or, in medical school, we're not really given training for nutrition or exercise, and that's where I love to excel, because I've used it for myself. I love exercise and I love nutrition, but it kind of trickles down. My interest always trickles down into my patients, and I'm not going to suggest everybody become a bodybuilder, runner, rock climber, or a vegan, but everybody has their own ways of getting to the point where they eliminate the disease process, and it all starts with information. So let's get into it. So hypoglycemia. My typical patient will say, I have breakfast and I have a lunch, but I have to have a little snack in between the breakfast and lunch because I become hypoglycemic. And again, having hypoglycemia or low glucose, if you have insulin, or if you're using insulin or oral sulfonylureas, that's reasonable, because those medicines will rock your sugar down. It's supposed to rock your sugar down. And one of the biggest threats with using any insulin form, whether it's long-acting, short-acting, or intermediate-acting, is it can drive your sugar below normal, and that's dangerous. Because as you see on this curve, this is millimoles, that's a measurement, and this is time. So this is supposed to be the level where we have a certain level where glucose always exists. The cool thing about this, and I'm going to give away a little spoiler, the cool thing about the body is if you don't have any oral hypoglycemics like glyburide or diabetic, or if you don't have any insulin, you shouldn't drop down to comatose levels. That's what hypoglycemia is. You worry about going comatose. But truly, if you're having symptoms of irritation, irritability, shakes, difficulty with thinking, palpitations, sweats, that's not really a hypoglycemia. That's not really a low glucose. That's a lower glucose level than you're used to, and then the body goes through fight or flight because it wants to say, hey, what's up with the glucose? So I was about to say sugar. And so it releases this stress response, and it says hunt for fuel. But trust me, if you're not on those two medicines like I mentioned, the chances of you diving below the deck as far as a glucose level in the bloodstream are very low. Again, the body is really good at it's built in to prevent that. So how does it do that? I'm going to go through a timeline here. So again, this is the amount of hormone that's circulating, hormone and glucose that's circulating in your bloodstream. This is the time. So let's take it as you eat something. That would be a glucose hit, because most of the time you eat something, whether it's a combination of carbohydrates, most meals in the United States are carbohydrates, fats, and proteins. For this talk, I'm just going to refer to carbohydrates as a very good glucose source, especially if you have a lousy carbohydrate. If you're processed foods where it's high glycemic index carbohydrates, which you shouldn't be doing, they taste good, but they'll cause you to have problems later on. So those three macronutrients get in. Let's just consider it a glucose hit, unless you're a keto person, and that's totally different. I'll be doing a keto video soon. So a glucose hit starts here. So what happens when you have a glucose hit or a fuel hit? You eat something. Immediately, if the stomach senses that you had some food and it's high carbohydrate, it's going to send a message to the pancreas, hey, we got a big carbohydrate hit, start making some insulin. So what's going to happen is these beta cells here in the this is a stomach, this is a liver, this is a gallbladder, and this is the pancreas. Pancreas has two cells in it. It does a lot more than that, but it has two cells in it, beta cells and alpha cells. Beta cells make insulin only when stimulated by the messages from the stomach. The stomach's really cool, because depending on the contents of the acidity and the protein contents of your meal that you just ate, and the sugar, the glucose content and the fat contents, it sends messages to this little gland that's right underneath of it, and it says, okay, we got something that's heavy carbohydrate. So I erased some of it. So what happens is the pancreas makes a ton of insulin to meet all that heavy carbohydrate fuel that you just ate that's getting broken down. So what happens here is green is insulin. Insulin gets secreted from the pancreas to meet the amount of glucose that you just ate. Remember, in your stomach, it's going to start to digest food, break it down into essential macronutrients, minerals, vitamins, and then it'll start to go through the pyloric sphincter and then into the small intestine for absorption. But before it gets absorbed, it has to be broken down. So it has to be going from solid, a solid piece of food that you just chewed into a liquid medium. So that's what's so cool. You have your own food processor in your stomach. You can turn anything solid into vomit, which is essentially a liquid. It takes a couple hours, but that's why the pancreas and the liver and the gallbladder are so contiguous. They're so close to the stomach because they feed off of each other as far as the hormone response and the messages to who has to secrete what. So insulin spikes from the beta cells to meet the amount of glucose. So when insulin spikes, insulin and glucose are lock and key. So when they meet together, they can come into the cell. They go from the bloodstream into the cell. So you can't, if you don't have any insulin, you can't get the glucose lock and key insulin combination into the cell. It just stays in the bloodstream, floats around. So this is cool because insulin meets the amount of sugar, glucose, and it goes down. I keep on saying sugar. I want to say sugar, but it's not the right term. So insulin and glucose meet, and then they get driven into the cells, out of the bloodstream, into the cells, because the basic premise is that the lining of the bloodstream is very delicate. It's almost the same lining as what you find in the heart. Very delicate cells, and if you constantly expose those delicate cells to high glucose, the black line, you'll irritate the cells. So what the blood vessels try to do to defend themselves is to let the glucose insulin combo get out of the bloodstream into the cell. And it also changes around osmolarity, so it's a defensive mechanism. Get all that stuff out of the bloodstream into the cell, and the cell would appreciate it because it needs it for fuel. All of the cells in the body use glucose as a primary source of fuel. You can also use ketones, beta-hydroxybutyrate, but to make it easy on this conversation, we'll just say get it out of the bloodstream into the cell. So the insulin and the glucose combine, they go lock and key, keep on getting into the cell, get it out of the bloodstream until you reach a certain level. Remember, this is millimoles. This is a measurement. You reach a certain level right about here, about 40 to 60. And usually when you hit a glucose of 40 to 60, the blood and the brain and the cells sense that, and they say, wait a minute, we can't go too low. So what does the pancreas do? Because the pancreas has beta cells that secrete insulin, but has the sugar, has the glucose continues to drop, this pancreas senses that there's not as much glucose anymore. So what does the pancreas do? It shuts down the beta cell secretion of insulin. And when it shuts down the beta cell secretion of insulin, suddenly this guy, alpha cells, get turned on, and alpha cells make glucagon. It will never drop below the deck. I mean, again, unless you're on a synthetic insulin medicine or an oral sulfonylurea medicine. But for those of you who are on berberine or cinnamon or chromium picolinate, you won't be able to drop below the deck. You'll have every symptom in the world, but you'll never pass out, believe it or not. So what happens at this level, at this threshold, is glucagon gets secreted. That's the red line, and it brings up, glucagon is responsible for the exact opposite of what insulin does from the pancreas, and it brings up gluconeogenesis or glucose. So glucose, when glucagon is secreted, the other opposite twin, it takes the glucose from glycogen. Glycogen is a storage packet of glucose. Takes the glucose there, fractionates it, and sends it out to the bloodstream. Because, again, it has to be, it's more gentle than insulin. Insulin bottoms out, meaning the hormone bottoms out, not the glucose. But glucagon doesn't spike. Insulin spikes, glucagon doesn't spike. That's why I made the curve kind of curve off. Glucagon doesn't spike. Glucagon just makes enough to get the bloodstream full of a little bit of glucose, and then it tapers off. I think the glucagon cell, the alpha cells, are a little more sensitive than the beta cells of the pancreas. The problem is, so that's how it works. Glucose spike, or fuel spike, insulin spike, they both meet. They get out of the bloodstream. Insulin continues to go into, it continues to secrete. Those beta cells are a little slow to respond. So you can sometimes go into an insulin dump, is what I call it. An insulin dump, usually you'll feel hungry. That's why I put symptoms right here. First, you'll have right about this point here where the insulin goes down and the glucagon comes up, you'll have ghrelin released. Ghrelin is a hormone. I'll put a link down below. Ghrelin is a hormone that comes out of the stomach when the stomach is empty. So if the stomach starts to empty everything and it's done digesting and it's kind of contracted, no more acid, no more food bolus, no nothing, then it'll start to go tiny. It takes about 3 to 6 hours, depending on the patient. And if you have diabetes sometimes slows down the movement of food. But when it's empty, then ghrelin starts to be secreted. That's the Ghrelin Growl I refer to. And when you have growling, your stomach is saying it's empty. And it's nothing bad, it's just your stomach is saying it's empty. And there's acid there. It might be thinking it's going to eat in about 3 hours, but why not start making noise now? Now that usually translates to most people as, because we're brought up this way, if you're growling, time to eat. Because if your mom hears you growling, or hears your stomach growling, she's going to give you something to, even if you're not hungry, she's going to give you some food. So we've been brainwashed into thinking when we have growling, we're supposed to feed our stomach something. It's not true. Growling is actually good. The one positive when you have the Ghrelin Growl start is that growth hormone gets secreted. So the thing with growth hormone is you have protein synthesis. Protein synthesis, protein growth, muscular growth. The muscle is so important with, if you have growth hormone, you'll have protein synthesis and you'll have muscle growth. And guess what body part does not need insulin to get the sugar, I said it again, sorry, to get the glucose out of the bloodstream into the cell? The muscle. Muscle does not need insulin to get glucose in. It's got a backdoor surprise. So that's what's so cool, because the more muscle you have, the faster you can be and the more efficient you can be at putting glucose that's floating around in the bloodstream right into the cell. Because the muscle has utilization of that. I think it's a fight or flight stimulus. Just in case you're running, you don't need to wait for the pancreas to make insulin, get it into the cell. You can have access right into the muscle. So that's really cool. But the problem is, as you get older, most Americans don't exercise, or they become atrophic. They can become skinnier. They might become, tummies might become bigger, but the muscles become sarcopenic. When the muscles become atrophic because there's no time to exercise or no stimulus to exercise, or you're suffering too much because of the insulin dumps, and you're not motivated to exercise, you're losing out on a big organ. Muscle is an organ that can help you bring your cholesterol or your sugar down. Sorry, your glucose down. You see, it rolls off the tongue. Sugar, glucose, and it shouldn't be sugar. So sugar is not good, but glucose by itself is not that bad. If you eat too much of it, bad. I would really highly suggest protein and protein, fats, and as low a carbohydrate level as you can tolerate. Now, that's different from Dean Ornish's work. He wants high healthy carbs, low fat, and moderate protein, but I don't have that many heart disease patients, and I have the average Joes and Janes come in, so I think this is more practical. But bottom line is, before I leave this topic, please develop your muscle. Please do something exercise-wise. That means resistance. That doesn't mean just walking. Walking is pretty good. 10,000 steps a day is a minimum. If you do 20,000 steps, cool, but how much time are you using? I'd rather have you hit the minimum, 10,000, but do some resistance exercise. Again, that's what gets the muscle to suck out the glucose from the bloodstream. If you suck out the glucose from the bloodstream, then you won't have a spike. If you suck out the glucose from the bloodstream, the glucose in the bloodstream will stop right here and you won't have an insulin spike. But it takes a lot of training to do that. When you're younger, your cells need less stimulus. But as you're older, I think it's very important to have something, and you want to go into your 50s and 60s with some muscle mass. So, as I was speaking of right about this junction here, is when a lot of my patients become symptomatic, hypoglycemic. It's not really hypoglycemic. Again, hypoglycemic is when you go below. That's when we have to revive you in the emergency room with an amp of D550 and maybe a chaser of insulin to balance you out. Yes, we have to do that sometimes in the emergency room if we get to a hypoglycemic coma, but that's not a common thing. Diabetic ketoacidosis is a common thing, and that's when we're chasing. You're going to the ICU. We're chasing you with insulin IV. That's acidosis balance problem, but for the concept that we're talking about here of hypoglycemia or low glucose, this is where usually the symptoms come up. And so bottom line here is, don't think that the symptoms of irritability, palpitations, sweatiness, shakiness. Don't think that they're all because of hypoglycemia or low glucose. Now, granted, if your brain and your muscle tissue is used to having that heavy load, the heavy load of glucose, well, it's going to get used to it. But what we have to do is stop the spiking, stop the constant feeding. So that's why I like to space out meals. I like to space out, I don't have breakfast, but if you have to have 3 meals a day, go for breakfast. Try to make it protein dominant if you can. I like to have protein dominance because sometimes that carbohydrate dominant breakfast will make you sleepy afterward because of the insulin spike. So protein dominant breakfast, wait about 4 to 6 hours, then have your protein dominant lunch, and then wait about 4 to 6 hours to have your carbohydrate, healthy carbohydrate or fat dominant dinner. That's the way I would play it. Some people feel that they have the symptoms right here, so they have to have their protein dominant breakfast, and then, or they have to have their breakfast, whatever the breakfast is. It's probably going to be carbohydrate dominant, but if you have a carbohydrate dominant breakfast, you're going to have the dumping right here, and then you're going to have the symptoms of pseudo-hypoglycemia, and you're going to want to hunt for something. But the only thing that hunting does is put you into another spike. If you have, especially if you have a candy, if you don't take any insulin, don't take any glyburide, diabeta. Metformin is totally different. Metformin will not drop you below the deck. That's what the beauty of metformin is. That's why we started so early, even in pre-diabetics. So I hope I'm not getting into the weeds here, but the problem would be over a time course, if you have your breakfast and you have a glucose spike and an insulin spike, and it's coming down, and suddenly you have the hypoglycemic symptoms, and you have another snack, probably a sugar, because it's fastest, and I meant to say sugar that time. The sugar will break down in the stomach to fructose and glucose, and the insulin will spike again. So you'll have another spike of glucose, and then you'll have they'll go down, and then you'll be timed for lunch, so this is a snack. And then lunch will bring you up again. So the problem with that is your insulin will chase everything. So your insulin will spike, you go back down. It'll spike, go back down. Spike. Your insulin never goes below the deck. And if you're constantly secreting insulin at a high level, you become insulin. All the cells are going to try to protect themselves, including this glucagon cell, this alpha cell, insulin resistant. So when you constantly have insulin always secreted every 3 hours because you're having your meal and your snack, another meal and a snack, a major meal at the end of the night and a snack at night, you're never allowing the insulin to go below the deck. And with that, you have constant bombardment of all of the cells with insulin. The insulin can be irritating. So what do the cells do? They try to shade themselves from the insulin, and they ignore the insulin. That's insulin resistance. When you have a cell that shades itself from the insulin because it's constantly being secreted, and it won't allow the insulin/glucose combination to enter the cell, you have just a high, what happens is you just have a constantly higher level of glucose all the time in the bloodstream with the insulin. And that's not good. Insulin as a hormone is anabolic to muscle. So it's, catabolic to muscle. It still breaks down muscle, but it is anabolic to fat. So insulin that's always in the system, always in the bloodstream, will want to make more fat. It'll make the liver produce more fat and LDL, bad cholesterol, and it's going to make the muscles wither away. If you can get glucagon and growth hormone, that'll make the muscles grow, make the fat dive. That's why it's nice to have that Ghrelin Growl, because you can assume that your fat's being pulled out of your tummy, and you can assume that muscle's being driven to growth if you stimulate it with exercise. So this is the big problem with having constant insulin and bunches of snacks. So I don't like the snack. If you can avoid this snack and this snack before dinner, then space this out by 6 hours, I think that'll be better. I do a vegan diet and a intermittent fasting kind of profile as far as my nutrition practice. So I actually don't eat until lunch and dinner. I have a small window, and my window is about to close. It's 7:53 at night. I usually stop at 7:30, so I got to stop until tomorrow when I eat again at lunchtime or so. So fasting has its benefits because you'll get ghrelin to secrete, you'll get growth hormone to secrete. I even work out fasted. I don't need exercise. To exercise, I don't need a hit of protein or glucose or sugar or energy drinks. Energy drinks, stop them. Any drink that comes in a can that's highly processed, even if it's sugar-free, stop, please. That's just driving your glucose higher, and you never get off this insulin roller coaster. So hopefully, I think I talked about everything. Well, two more things. Very rarely can you have something called a Somogy effect or a dawn phenomenon. Sometimes in the morning, you'll have a dawn phenomenon. High glucose level because of either too much of a meal, heavy meal, carbohydrate dominant meal last night, or the insulin/glucagon is playing with the glucose levels and you wake up with high glucose. So, but again, those two things, dawn phenomenon and Somogy effect, are very rare. So if you can stop the snacks and get the body kind of used to not having the insulin around, it'll get better. It'll take about, it's like a withdrawal. Because most of my guys who try to rescue their hypoglycemia, they take in a candy or a pop, a Coke. On the trail, I use this glucose gel. You can put it in even a unconscious hiker. You can put it in their mouth and then under the tongue. You just swipe it under there, and it'll get absorbed through the bloodstream if that person is not too dehydrated. So if you can get used to the glucose going a little bit on the low side and the insulin kind of also following the path and not spiking so much, that if the insulin's like this, better off. If the glucose is like this, better off. I've got a lot of keto patients, or not a lot, but I've got paleo and keto followers. Great concept. But you'll still, even with protein, you'll still spike an insulin response. The insulin response with protein will just be a little quicker. It's not like the long-lasting carbohydrate insulin response. So you'll still spike it, but I think my keto guys are doing great. I like the concepts that are coming out with all the PhDs nowadays, and now they're getting more information with the glucagon. But it still comes down to designing something for you and getting out of the old school thinking, and also getting used to exercise again, using that muscle if you can develop it, getting used to the brain fog from all the medicines you're on. And if you get to the point where, bottom line is, if you can drop the weight, the diseases go away. But the problem is, I usually see 40, 50, or 60-year-olds, it's tough to drop the weight. You have 50-hour work weeks, you got kids to take care of, you have a spouse to take care of. There's a lot of stuff. Your work is so concentrated, and there's all stress. And then there's aging. So it is difficult, but it's not impossible. And just look at the flip side. If you don't invest, you will be on insulin, and insulin causes you to gain more weight. And with more weight, this whole cycle gets screwed up. So please try to do your best with this. Hope it gives you a couple of ideas. If you have any comments, put them down below. Otherwise, don't forget to subscribe, because I put videos out like this all the time. And hopefully you'll see it in the next tutorial.